continue our discussion with our guest host. We were just talking about the gold standard, and Congressman Paul identified me as one of those paper people, which is not the worst thing somebody has said about me on TV here. Congressman, one of the problems with the gold standard that has been pointed out by economists is the inability of the government to respond with lower interest rates in a recession. And the idea that the government is hamstrung. In fact, it has to raise interest rates to keep the gold in the country. Is that what you want the government doing during a recession, is to raise interest rates?
What I want is a market economy. I don't want the dependency. Matter of fact, that's the big disadvantage of paper because of the moral hazard. If we get into trouble, we always know the lender of last resort. It was set up for that reason. 1930, the lender of last resort. Gamble, do anything, take risks, the government's insurance. So they get into that trouble. But if they get into trouble, they shouldn't come and rescue the economy. They shouldn't be bailing out General Motors and these trillions of dollars with both the Fed and the Congress. That was set up. The mortgage, and I complained about that for 10 years. You know, this line of credit of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that is the moral hazard. Paper money is a moral hazard, encourages people to make a lot of risky investment, malinvestments, and they overdo things. They overinvest. A lot of times they talk about the inflation, they talk about the price level, but really the biggest problem with inflating the money supply and giving you artificially low interest rates is the malinvestment. People overinvest in investing in areas that they shouldn't be investing in, so you shouldn't guarantee that they're going to be bailed out.
But it is conventional wisdom that one of the reasons why the recession in 29-30 became a Great Depression was because of the gold standard. And there's research showing that those countries that got off the gold standard the quickest were the quickest to recover.
Well, what you have to do is find out why we had a depression, and it was because we inflated in the 1920s. So the Fed, you know, this is interesting because Bernanke is the expert, and he says the Fed was at fault because they didn't print enough money fast enough, and he always guaranteed he would, and he's lived up to his word. He's gotten his helicopters out there, and he's dumping it out by the trillions of dollars. So I'll tell you, the big problem was the Fed, but the Fed, according to free market economic and business cycle theory, is that they inflated, which causes the distortion, and the recession is inevitable. You should be talking about 1920, 1921. They did the same thing. They had to inflate once again. We had the Fed. We inflated for the war. Then we had to have the correction. But nobody remembers 1921. 1921 was 1 year severe depression. But they did nothing. They just allowed interest rates to go up, the collapse, GDP went down, and they were back on their feet again. The prolongation was we were propping up the system and not allowing the bad debt to be liquidated. We're doing the same thing again. We're into it 5 years. Japan did the same thing. So we're going to be in this for a long, long time because we're not allowing the liquidation of debt. And when you expect the Fed to come in and save them, they're not permitting the liquidation debt. We buy the debt. We transfer the debt from those who had been making a lot of money in the derivatives, and we dump it on the taxpayer. It's a very immoral system.
What would the cost be? Where would unemployment be today if we didn't pursue the bailouts, if the Fed didn't inject the money that it did into the economy? What's your expectation for either unemployment, however you want to look at GDP in the economy right now?
There are variables. What would you do with the tax code, and what would you do with spending? I want to cut $1 trillion of spending. You know, I want the people to spend the money, not the government. So what you need to do is, what are you going to do with capital gains? What are you going to do with?
No, I appreciate that, but I'm just saying, if you took the bailouts off the table, for example, and you didn't, I mean, people would argue, you've argued that it's effectively steroids, what the Fed has put it. If you took that out of the system, where would we be right now?
Well, the cost would obviously be a lot less. It wouldn't be trillions and trillions of dollars of obligation. It wouldn't be this shrinking of the middle class.
But would unemployment be 8%? Would it be 16%?
You don't know the numbers, but I bet it'd be a lot better than it is now. We would have liquidated the debt. Housing prices, instead of doing this and this and this for 6 years, what you would have had was this, and it'd be people would, $100,000 house is now worth $10,000. Now let's go buy it. People who saved, could start buying their houses again. But the system, once you correct the monetary system, you might be rewarded for savings, and we get back to the market. The allocation of credit now is all done by the Fed.
Even if you're right, the temporary pain has to be enormous, though. You do recognize that.
Well, the long-term pain is 10 times worse than temporary pain. Sure, it could be a year. And like I said,
but no, a year. I mean,
in 1920, 21, it was one bad year. year and a half maybe.
But that's what it concerns me too. I understand the logic of thinking we have gotten on this system that has steroids. We have gotten carried away with things. The Fed allowed that entire housing bubble to build up, and so it has to come back down. What concerns me is when you start talking about $1 trillion in cuts immediately rather than over the course of a decade or longer, when you start talking about getting rid of, or going back to the gold standard and getting rid of this ability to print money and print your way out of things. I mean, I can't even imagine the unforeseen consequences. We talk about the unforeseen consequences that come with Dodd-Frank or something else along the way. I can't even imagine the unforeseen consequences that would come with that much of a shock to the system, where you are basically ripping off everything that's been created over the last 5-6 decades.
Okay, if it's 1 year or so, that's different. But what your argument would say is, let's do it over 5 or 10 years. Let's have this another worldwide depression is going to be very, very slow. And this is different than even the Depression. This is much bigger and much worse. But there is a good example in the history of big cuts. World War II. We cut the budget by approximately 60%. Taxes were cut 30%. And we had 10 million military personnel come back, and they say, we have to have jobs programs, because there was the New Deal stuff. They didn't even have time to start the jobs program. But by that time, all the bad debt was liquidated. People came back. 10 million people were hired, and we had an economic boom. The Depression finally ended after World War II, about 46, 47.
But tax rates went up significantly. I just looked at a lot of the IRS data for another column that I'd been working on, and taxes went up incredibly in terms of the collection. They brought all new people into the. I looked back at the tax rates.
Because more people were working.
But not only were more people working, but the rates went on people who were making a lot less money. People who had been making less money were suddenly they were collecting taxes from all of them going up. There were things like the national victory tax. I looked at the tax rates and I couldn't figure out why they'd gone up so much until I called the IRS.
After World War II?
As World War II started, as they got into it.
Oh, yeah, sure. But afterwards, a lot of that stuff was put aside,
right,
which helped my argument, because they got rid of that and they allowed people to go back to work and pay, and the revenues went up mainly because there were more people working. But it was still flawed because we still had the Fed to deal with and things came back. But it was so much better than it had been after we got out of the way. Germany's recovery was really when they decided no wage and price controls over there and rejected the American Keynesian advice to put on wage and price controls. And Europe recovered, and especially in Germany, by just not following our advice.
Congressman, does the Walmart story relative to what's happening in Mexico and this allegation of bribery, does that fit into your economic framework or anything? What is your reaction to the
how did you say that?
The idea that Walmart is alleged to have paid bribes in Mexico and is alleged to have covered it up for many years?
Well, I don't know the details of that, but if people are corrupt and paying bribes, I mean, that doesn't sound like anything anybody can defend. So why would you blame free markets or sound money on
I'm
that?
not blaming free markets. I just wondered if you had a reaction to the story.
Oh no. Actually, I have a lot of respect. I don't know the details of that. I have a lot of respect for Walmart because it's a good business. The only time I get a little hesitant is when they use eminent domain. When they want some special properties and they take private property. I don't like that part of it, and I believe they've used that.
Okay, more to come from our guest host, Ron